This video was originally going to be called Carlo Gambino and the Golden Age of the Mafia, but after going through the declassified FBI files on him, which were thousands of pages, it became clear that his reign began after Cosa Nostra hit its peak of power. I say this because other bosses like Gaetano Galliano and Vincenzo Mangano flew under the FBI's radar during their reigns in the 1940s, which allowed them to live their lives without constant government surveillance, an experience that Carlo Gambino was unable to avoid, and that was a source of unhappiness in his lifetime. Mob guys can be mostly broken down into two categories: those who can earn money and those who can be violent for enforcement. Gambino was a third type, the effective manager who knows how to blend both groups. He is remembered as probably the most successful Cosa Nostra boss of all time because his almost 20-year rule was largely peaceful by Mafia standards, as it did not have a civil war. He was a Machiavellian that read Machiavelli, and he took the lesson to heart that one should be both a fox and a lion. He was a lion in that he projected a power that was too strong to be challenged, and he was a fox because he would outthink his enemies to make quick and decisive moves to win conflicts before they broke out. But what really makes him stand out from the other bosses is that he died in his home from natural causes rather than be murdered on the street or rot away in a prison. A distinction that no other boss from the Gambino family was able to enjoy during the 20th century. Carlo Gambino was born on August 24, 1902, in Palermo, Sicily. It's rumored that he came from a Mafia-connected family and that one of his uncles was a captain in the local outfit. He had 3 brothers and 2 sisters. His parents, sisters, and one brother remained in Sicily, while 2 of his brothers, Paul and Giuseppe, later immigrated to the United States. Carlo came to America in 1921, just after the Immigration Act of 1921 was passed, which created limiting quotas based on country. The FBI believed that he entered the country illegally as a stowaway on a ship from Italy when it docked in Virginia Beach. From there, he made his way to Brooklyn and connected with Salvatore D'Aquila. D'Aquila was once a captain in Peter Morello's family, but in the 1910s, he broke away and his crew became an independent family. Gambino's brother Paul also crossed the ocean in the 1920s, and they became official members in D'Aquila's organization as soldiers. D'Aquila was murdered on the street in 1928, with Joe the Boss Masseria behind the hit. D'Aquila's underboss, Manfredi Mineo, was then promoted to be the family's new leader, and he became a Masseria ally. It's highly likely that Mineo played a role in his boss's murder. During the Castello-Marese War, Mineo sided with Joe the Boss against Salvatore Maranzano, but there was a lot of discontent in the family's rank and file. Many were bitter to be fighting for the man who had their old boss killed. A major turning point in that conflict happened on November 5, 1930, when Maranzano's soldiers ambushed Mineo and his underboss, killing both men with a spray of bullets. Maranzano exploited the resentment of the now leaderless family and backed capo regime Frank Scalise to be the new boss in exchange for him and his soldiers to switch sides. Most members, including Carlo Gambino, went along with this. The following year, in 1931, Maranzano won the war, but he was dead a few months later when his rival Lucky Luciano outmaneuvered him. Luciano then formed the commission and removed Scalise from the boss position. He instead installed the powerful capo regime Vincenzo Mangano in his place. The 5 families saw some reshuffling in the war's aftermath. For the newly renamed Mangano family, they merged with Albert Anastasia's Calabrian gang to create a larger organization that would later be renamed for Carlo. This family had 3 factions: the Mangano loyalists, the Calabrians who leaned toward Anastasia, and the rest of the Sicilians where demoted boss Frank Scalise still had a lot of influence. Carlo Gambino was part of the third group, though he did his best to always appear neutral. Sometime during the 1930s, Carlo became a capo regime with his own crew. We don't have any first-hand accounts of his actions during the Castello-Marisi War, but to be a member of the Mafia, you need to be capable of violence, and usually that is proven by doing something that is violent. But Carlo Gambino's real talent that got him promoted was that he knew how to make money in creative ways. For example, once Prohibition ended in 1933, the mob needed to find other ways to make money, and almost everyone abandoned bootlegging. But Gambino stuck with it, knowing that there was a market for people who wanted cheap, untaxed liquor. Since Prohibition had just ended, many people remembered the fine alcohol products they purchased from their local bootleggers, so this was a continuation of an old business with an existing customer base. One of his locations in Newark, New Jersey, was raided by the police. Gambino, his brother Paul, and several other men were arrested. Paul fled to Sicily to avoid trial, but Carlo stayed behind. A jury, probably bitter about the government's experimentation with Prohibition, declined to convict Carlo for selling alcohol without a license. That acquittal didn't make the government very happy, and they went after Gambino again, this time for tax evasion, as his business model was built on not paying the alcohol taxes. He was convicted and sentenced to spend 2 years in the federal prison at Lewisburg in Pennsylvania. From the FBI records, it looked like he appealed this case, and a judge granted him a new trial. As it was about to get underway, he reached an agreement with prosecutors where he pled guilty and was sentenced to time served, which at this point had been just over a year. This incident would be the only time Carlo Gambino went to prison, despite the government's relentless efforts. During World War II, it's believed that he became incredibly rich in a very unpatriotic way. While the United States homeland was spared from any fighting, the population still needed to make sacrifices through rationing so that the war got the resources it needed. This was enforced through ration cards, which were the only way that items like gasoline, sugar, meat, and other everyday essentials could be purchased. Gambino bribed and made deals with the officials who controlled the physical cards, where he was able to steal some before they went to the public. He then sold these back to the people who wanted more than their allotment and made a fortune. This scam he had going was well known in the underworld, to the point where members of other families would bring him stolen ration cards for him to fence. In Joe Valachi's unpublished memoirs that can be found online, he told a story where he brought some cards to Paul Gambino and then felt like the brothers scammed him. Frank Scalise tried to mediate a compromise between them, but it ended with Valachi getting angry, flipping a table, and walking out. The dispute went up the ladder to underboss Albert Anastasia, and a sit-down was called. Anastasia ruled in Valachi's favor, while also scolding him for his behavior during the first meeting. In the aftermath of World War II, Carlo Gambino remained one of the Mangano family's best earners. In addition to traditional mob moneymakers like hijacking and gambling, he was one of the first to branch out into labor racketeering through control of workers' unions. With this power, he could blackmail business owners into hiring him as a labor consultant so that they could avoid worker strikes. This money would then be what he reported on his taxes as income. FBI documents list that Gambino was involved in the narcotics trade during the late 1940s, although he was never charged. If this intelligence is true, then it means that his later policy of death to any member that deals drugs was about avoiding stiff prison sentences where someone could be willing to flip instead of being about the moral principle that drugs ruin communities. Gambino prided himself on staying in the shadows while keeping a low profile. He used violence only when necessary and largely avoided law enforcement during the 1940s. To his superiors, he was viewed as loyal but not ambitious. His own crew was known to be very dedicated to him as he was fair, respectful, shrewd, and not impulsive or domineering. He also maintained relationships with members of other families and became close with Vito Genovese after he returned to the United States. When 1950 rolled around, there was a lot of tension in the family because of conflicts between Mangano and Anastasia. It was said that Mangano resented Anastasia communicating directly with the bosses of other families instead of going through him, while Anastasia felt constrained in the number 2 position. On April 19, 1951, Mangano's brother Philip was found murdered with 3 bullets in his head. Because the mobsters then did a better job of keeping their oath of omerta back then, we don't know if Philip was the family consigliere or a very powerful capo. When the police went to Vincent Mangano's house to tell him about his brother's death, he was not home. He disappeared and was never seen again. It's believed that Anastasia had them both killed, and just like that, the Mangano faction was no longer a power player in the family. There were most likely 10 capos in the family then, each with a crew between 10 and 20 soldiers. They met and voted to make Anastasia the new boss, and he was confirmed by the commission. Gambino threw his support behind him. Anastasia promoted Frank Scalise to be his underboss. This made sense because he was very powerful and well-liked, plus the Sicilian faction needed to have one of their guys at the top in order to maintain harmony. Joe Biondo is believed to have been the consigliere during this time. Anastasia was a guy who specialized in violence, and it would be fair to call him a psychopath. Mangano might have restrained him before, but now that he was the boss, there was no one to hold him back. 3 murders that he ordered violated the mob's rules, as he went after civilians that had no involvement in his world. One was that he ordered Good Samaritan Arnold Schuster killed because he tipped off the cops to Willie Sutton when he saw the bank robber on the street. Anastasia is said to have done it because he hated squealers. The other 2 killings was a contractor and his wife. The contractor worked on his Fort Lee mansion and testified about how much his work cost during Anastasia's tax evasion trial. They later disappeared with the only clue to their whereabouts being blood found on the curtains in their home. As time went on, Anastasia's violence became more unhinged, and the capos who supported him in 1951 were now afraid that he would have them killed next for some minor offense. Things reached their climax in 1957, and these events are what led to the end of the Italian-American Mafia's golden age. In what would become known as the Genovese family, there was a power struggle between boss Frank Costello and his underboss Vito Genovese. Behind the scenes, Anastasia backed Costello and considered him a friend, while Gambino became close to Genovese. On May 2nd, Costello was ambushed in his building lobby by Genovese enforcer Vincent Gigante. Gigante shot Costello in the head and ran, but the bullet only skimmed the boss and he survived. It was enough to spook him, and he stepped down to retire while passing the mantle to his rival. Now Anastasia lost his main supporter on the commission. On June 17th, underboss Frank Scalise was shot and killed on a Bronx street while buying fruit. It's been rumored that he was accepting bribes from family associates to propose their membership into the family. Anastasia may or may not have also been in on the scam, but once the allegations were made, Scalise was marked for death. Popular family capo, Carlo Gambino, was then promoted into the number 2 role. During that summer, tensions in the mob appeared to ease, and Anastasia's other ally on the commission, Joe Bonanno traveled to Sicily in the fall for what he called a family vacation. Investigators claim that the real motive was to set up a heroin distribution pipeline. During Bonanno's absence, Albert Anastasia was murdered on October 25th as he sat in a barbershop in Manhattan. He had obviously not felt that his life was in danger, and the attack came as a complete surprise. Who exactly ordered the hit will never be fully known. One theory is that a group of capos in his family did it as they feared that he was going to have them killed. The other is that Carlo Gambino was behind it as he benefited the most from his boss's death. And a third possibility is that there is truth in both ideas. Regardless of who was behind it, the family found itself in a power vacuum, and Gambino was quick to act to secure its and his future. In 1985, when John Gotti orchestrated the murder of Paul Castellano, the only other person killed besides the boss was his right-hand man, Tommy Bellotti, and their assassinations happened together. After that, the captains of the Gambino family unanimously supported Gotti's ascent into the boss's role. 28 years earlier, Carlo Gambino's securing of power was not as bloodless after the initial assassination. From what we understand through informants during that era, Capo regime Joe Riccobono appeared in front of the commission just after the murder of Albert Anastasia and claimed that he and fellow Capo regime Joe Biondo had orchestrated the killing as an act of self-defense, because Anastasia was going to have them killed. This was the same defense that Albert used in 1951 after his boss, Vincent Mangano, disappeared, although then he stopped short of actually saying he murdered him. Newly crowned boss Vito Genovese and Lucchese family boss Tommy Lucchese did not like Anastasia, and they provided cover for the captains while also throwing their support behind Carlo Gambino, becoming his family's new leader. It's very likely that Gambino was also part of the conspiracy as well, since he benefited the most from it. Perhaps he too feared Anastasia and knew that it would only be a matter of time before he did something to upset the volatile man. It should be noted that Joe Bonanno, in his memoirs, had personal hatred for Gambino, though a lot of these feelings probably came in the 1960s when his plans to take over the commission to become the boss of bosses failed, leading to his eventual retirement and exile. Anyway, Bonanno was not in New York when Anastasia's murder occurred, and he was not present at the commission to raise any objections. But while the commission approval for his ascent to the top position was secured, there was discontent among the other capos and their crews that needed to be dealt with. The merger between Mangano's Sicilians and Anastasia's Calabrians into what is now known as the Gambino family happened in 1931. But with both men being leading figures in the family for decades, 26 years later in 1957, these divisions still existed. When looking at the Anastasia family of 1957, there were still three factions: Anastasia's loyalists, the Sicilians, who Gambino took leadership of after Frank Scalise's demise, and Joe Biondo, who had essentially assumed control of what was the Mangano faction. The Anastasia faction was composed of about half the family's membership, while the other two factions each had a quarter. Anastasia's administration reflected these divisions, as Gambino was his underboss, and Biondo is believed to have been his consigliere. But with his death, the balance of power was now disturbed, as there were promotions to be made to conspirators to reward their roles. Biondo was bumped up to underboss, while Riccobono was promoted to consigliere. Seeing as how the commission was backing Don Carlo, the Anastasia faction had two choices: go along with it or go to war through a rebellion. That hasn't happened since the 1930s, and it was a bridge that not many were willing to recklessly cross. Instead, they decided to sit back and quietly bide their time. Gambino's reign got off to a very bad start when in 1957, Vito Genovese decided to hold a national conference in Appalachian, New York, among all of the country's families to discuss how things have changed in New York. The meeting did not make much progress before it was raided by local state troopers who were curious why so many known criminals with fancy cars were in their town. This was a cultural event that shocked the American public. For years, there had been rumors of a national crime syndicate, along with high-profile Senate hearings that grilled known mobsters, but there were also a lot of prominent voices who dismissed such an idea as a conspiracy theory. The most prominent naysayer was FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover. Now, those doubts could no longer be entertained when 62 high-ranking Cosa Nostra members were arrested as they all got together, including Don Carlo. Faced with the embarrassment that they were behind in the fight against organized crime, the FBI began extensive investigations into every man they arrested, and they also assigned task forces to have teams surveil the men 24 hours a day. For a man who preferred to stay in the shadows as he exercised his power, this was a nightmare for Carlo Gambino. Declassified FBI documents that are available to the public through the Freedom of Information Act reveal that his Massapequa home was bugged. He lived in Brooklyn during the week and the Long Island residence was a weekend vacation home, so it was not hard for the FBI to break into it. And whenever he traveled, he was followed, and the hotel phones were also bugged as well, so that every conversation was heard. The room was also spied on from outside, and many intimate conversations with his wife were no longer private. The FBI agents on his case needed a full-time Sicilian interpreter to be on their staff so they could translate in real time what he was saying, as he would frequently switch between that and English. One of the conversations they deciphered was him on the phone telling the other person that he knows he is being listened to and that they can figure out what he is saying despite speaking another language. Gambino knew better than to discuss business at home or where he knew he was being watched. If he really needed to get a message out or speak to someone urgently, he used a payphone that was randomly picked so that he knew it was surveillance-free. There is a story that he would tell younger soldiers in the family that they needed to be both like the fox and the lion. The lion is strong, while the fox is cunning. This is a section direct from Machiavelli's The Prince, and using the timeless lessons from that book, Carlo continued to rule his family while also further securing his power. Gambino's biggest rival during his early days was Capo Regime Tommy Rava, an Anastasia loyalist who was seen as the leader of the Old Bosses faction after his death. Johnny Robliotto was a member of the family and also part of that faction. According to Joe Valachi, he paid Robliotto a visit on behalf of the Genovese family to warn him against joining in on any conspiracy. Robliotto told him that he would stay neutral. Shortly after that, Robliotto was found dead on a Brooklyn street with multiple bullet wounds. The rumor is that Rava had him killed for betraying him. Rava and Gambino maintained the appearance that everything was good between them, and Rava even accompanied his new boss at Appalachian. But while he was out on bail, he either was tipped off that there was a plan against him, or he decided to get out of New York because his own conspiracy was about to spring into motion. Regardless of his motive, he fled to Florida while out on bail. He then disappeared and was never seen or heard from again. 3 years later, in 1960, another Anastasia loyalist, Capo Regime Vincent Squillante, also disappeared. He was with Anastasia when he was murdered at the barber shop, but the killers spared him and he ran away. With Rava and Squillante out of the picture, there was only one more Anastasia captain who was seen as a possible threat to Don Carlo, and that was Aniello Della Croce, one of only 2 mobsters that actually scared New York detective Ralph Salerno. But Della Croce did not have the power to challenge Gambino with Rava and Squillante out of the picture. Instead, he made peace with the administration and agreed to pledge his loyalty. It was a promise he would keep and eventually be rewarded for. With the subversion in his ranks squashed, Gambino led his family into new rackets to make it more prosperous. The creation of container shipping began in the 1950s, and by the time the 60s came around, the waterfront was not as lucrative as it once was. It was still an important racket, and the Mafia still had heavy influence on the Union, but the amount of labor needed to unload ships plummeted, so the Gambino family branched out into other unions, mainly construction. By the time of his death in 1976, the Mafia had pretty much captured that entire industry in the New York City area, making the cost of building anything more expensive. But to him, this was a wise move, because he saw the money that could be made in criminal activities that didn't require violence. That's not to say that the family left those activities. There were many crews that stuck to that, and hijacking was still a valuable business for the family as well. In 1962, Gambino's son Tommy married Gaetano Lucchese's daughter. This marriage brought the two crime families closer, and they agreed to split the criminal activities taking place at and near JFK Airport. Another event during Gambino's early rule came in 1963 during the Profaci-Gallo War that consumed what is today known as the Colombo family. This war was a rebellion in original boss Joe Profaci's family against his financial exploitation of his soldiers, and it is rumored that Gambino met with the rebellious Gallo brothers while offering them covert support. He tried to broker a peace agreement between that family's two factions, but Profaci rebuked him, believing that Gambino had larger designs on his organization. Profaci died of natural causes in 1962, and his longtime underboss Joe Magliocco was elected by the captains to take his place. But Gambino swayed the other commission members to deny their recognition of him. They claimed that he could not take the top job while the family faced an open insurrection. Joe Bonanno did not like the Genovese-Gambino-Lucchese alliance, and he took advantage of Magliocco's bitterness to propose that they kill the other bosses and take control of the national crime syndicate with Bonanno as the boss of bosses and Magliocco as his second-in-command. Magliocco agreed and gave the contract to his trusted captain, Joe Colombo. Joe Colombo saw this as a bad idea, and he went to Gambino to inform him of the plan. Joe Bonanno fled New York, while Joe Magliocco answered his summoning to the commission and confessed. He was ordered to pay a fine to cover the costs of the investigation into him and then forced to retire. He died of natural causes the next year. Colombo was appointed to be that family's new boss, and Gambino saw a younger man who he could guide and even manipulate with his influence. The Bonanno family fell into its own civil war that concluded with Joe being booted and sent into exile at Arizona. While Gambino was able to run his family, the constant surveillance on him by law enforcement had never really let up. On September 22, 1966, Gambino, Joe Colombo, Thomas Eboli, Santo Trafficante Jr., and Carlos Marcello were having lunch at the La Stella Italian restaurant in Forest Hills, Queens. They were in a private room, most likely holding a commission meeting, when police suddenly burst in. The cops were tipped off about the meeting between many known criminals, and all were arrested in an event that the papers called Little Appalachian. Every one of them invoked their Fifth Amendment right and refused to talk to the police. As a result, no indictments were issued. Don Carlo's reign can be divided into two parts based on who his underbosses were. When he first came to power in 1957, Joe Biondo was promoted into the role as a reward for his part in the Anastasia murder. By 1965, Biondo was 68, while Gambino was 63. The two men had a falling out that year when it was revealed that Biondo had his own private rackets that he was not sharing with the rest of the family. This was probably the final straw in years of strain between the two powerful men, but it was an opportunity for Carlo to remove his underboss with cause. But Biondo was not killed like an Anastasia loyalist that couldn't be trusted. Instead, he was forced to retire while being allowed to keep some personal rackets so that he had a little income to get by with. Carlo Gambino then made a political move by promoting Agnello della Croce into the newly opened underboss role. The family's factions were now all once again represented, and Gambino knew that with della Croce, he had a man that would choose doing the right thing as a soldier in the life rather than giving in to his personal ambitions. In 1967, Consigliere Joe Riccobono also stepped down to retire, and in his place, Joe N. Gallo was promoted. This man had no relation to the Gallo brothers in the Colombo family. He was 10 years younger than Carlo, while della Croce, who went by the Americanized name of Neil, was 12 years younger than his boss. During Gambino's entire reign, he was always under scrutiny. It was most intense in the 5 years after Appalachian because Attorney General Robert Kennedy was determined to go after the Mafia. Kennedy showed special disdain for Gambino because of his marriage partner. Gambino's wife Catherine, born Catherine Castellana, was also a relative of his mother. Technically, they were first cousins, and Kennedy asked government agents to investigate his children to see if they had any mental conditions or birth defects. When Kennedy left the Johnson administration, the law enforcement pressure eased a little, but it was always there. In 1967, his homes and safe deposit boxes at different banks were raided. A detailed inventory of everything inside was made, including the cash and its serial numbers. The money was cross-checked to see if it came from any documented robberies. It didn't, but they believed some of the jewelry to have come from a Manhattan store that was previously robbed. If they thought that they had Gambino on possession of stolen property, then they must have been disappointed, because the case ended up going nowhere, and he was never charged. Gambino would later be under investigation again in 1970 for being part of a conspiracy to rob an armored car in Boston. The charges would later be dropped due to his old age and declining health. The true extent of Carlo Gambino's health will never be known. If what is in government records is to be taken at face value, then he was a very sick man beginning 1948. But it's also hard to believe that a man in such poor health could have been running one of the 5 families, in addition to eventually dominating the commission. Gambino's health first became an issue to the government when they made moves to deport him shortly after his arrest at Appalachian. Unlike other bosses from his generation that came from Italy, he made zero effort to become a legal immigrant, let alone an American citizen. So because of this vulnerability, authorities decided that it would be best to deport him back to his own country. The first efforts to do this were delayed after Gambino was admitted into the hospital with a heart condition that required him to rest. As it was considered a danger to his life to kick him out, a judge let him stay. This created a pattern that would go on for years. He would be close to being deported, he would have a health scare, and his lawyers would make moves to get him to stay. They finally gave up in the 1970s, when after the closest they came to having dates and deadlines for him to get out, his health went down again. He might have had serious health issues, or he might have had doctors on his payroll who could embellish his details when needed. The FBI went on to interview one to see if they were being lied to, and his answers were sufficient enough for the agents to not require a follow-up visit. By the time Gambino made Agnello della Croce his underboss in the mid-1960s, his control over the family had solidified, and his system for dealing with law enforcement was established. He was not flashy, despite being described by the FBI as well-dressed, and he preferred to stay out of the public light. It was well known to the public that he was one of the most powerful mob bosses in the country, but he would never give interviews or speak to reporters. Outside of his world, he would only occasionally speak with the FBI agents that always watched him, and in those cases it would be to show them how many pills his doctor makes him take daily. Carlo Gambino was in his late 60s, and he took on the public persona of the quiet grandfather. He seemed so frail and weak, where it was hard for people to believe who he really was. But behind closed doors, he ran a tight ship, and dissidents in the family or disputes were quickly resolved before they could fester into larger problems. Outside of public view, the old man could be as vicious as ever. Age did not mellow him out, and while he was not the one doing the killing anymore, he could order it. He often tried to avoid that because he wanted to keep a low profile, but if it was needed, it would be done. In 1972, his nephew Manny Gambino was kidnapped, and a ransom was demanded from Carlo for $350,000 to be paid. After negotiating, 40 grand was delivered to the kidnappers during a drop, but Manny never returned home. His car was later found in the Newark Airport long-term parking lot, which looked like he might have taken a flight somewhere to disappear. Unfortunately for his family, his body was shortly discovered buried in the sitting position at a New Jersey garbage dump. Manny was the son of Carlo's brother Joe, and Joe was not believed to have been part of Cosa Nostra. When the FBI first learned of the kidnapping, they offered to help the family. At first, that offer was declined, but as the disappearance's length dragged on, Manny's parents reached out. Manny was an associate of his uncle's crime family, as the books were still closed following Appalachian during this period. Investigators learned that he was working as a loan shark and had a lot of money on the street. One of his biggest debtors was Robert Center. Investigators dug deeper and learned that Center had rented a van during the night of the ransom delivery and that it matched the one used during the drop. Center was picked up, and perhaps knowing that he was exposed and would be killed if he was released, he confessed and named two other accomplices, Eddie Maloney and John Kilcullen. Both men were arrested and convicted for the crime. Center was sentenced to 15 years in prison for his part. Apparently, Manny Gambino was not the first mobster who was kidnapped by this group. Don Carlo wanted revenge for his nephew, and word began to spread that another man, James McBratney, had been part of their crew as well. Investigators don't believe that he was involved with the Manny Gambino abduction though, but for the mob, it didn't really matter. He was part of that group, he was on the streets, and an example needed to be made. This is where John Gotti enters the story. Gotti had been an associate of the family since he was a teenager, back when Albert Anastasia was boss. He came into the orbit of Queen's Capo regime Carmine Fatico. Fatico interacted directly with Gambino, and it's believed that Gotti and Gambino met before when he accompanied the Capo to meetings. Gotti also had a close relationship with family underboss Aniello Della Croce. Whether Gambino directly ordered Gotti to kill McBratney, like he does in the HBO movie, is not relevant. Bottom line is that Gotti, his close friend Angelo Ruggiero, and Ralph Gallioni found McBratney in a Staten Island bar one night. They tried to pretend that they were detectives, but the man did not believe them. A fight broke out. Gotti and Ruggiero held McBratney down as Gallioni shot him 3 times. Gotti was sentenced to 4 years in prison for his role in the murder. He was released in less than 2. While he was away, the books reopened, and because of this incident, plus his general record, he was inducted into the family in 1977. In 1976, with his health in serious decline, Gambino met with his consigliere Joe N. Gallo, plus Capos James Filer and Ettore Zappi, to inform them that he wanted Capo regime Paul Castellano to be the new boss after him. Castellano was Gambino's cousin, as well as his brother-in-law. The reason for this was that Castellano was more focused on white-collar crime, and Gambino felt this was the way of the future. Underboss and family powerhouse Agnello Della Croce was in prison for tax evasion during this time, but many capos and soldiers were loyal to him. To those that heard Gambino's wishes, they gave their blessing while keeping their misgivings private. But there was a lot of fear about what this might bring. Gambino died in his home from a heart attack on October 15, 1976. It was said to have been a peaceful death. When he became boss in 1957, all of the members on the commission were Italian-born. When he died, he was the last, with the next generation of younger Italian Americans now occupying leadership roles. In November, on Thanksgiving Day, Della Croce was released from prison and the tensions were high. A meeting was called for the family's leadership to choose the new boss at Nino Gaggi's home. Gaggi was nervous that violence could break out between Castellano's and Della Croce's supporters, so he taped a gun under the table. He ordered his nephew Dominic to wait upstairs with an automatic rifle in case shooting broke out. Instead, Della Croce played the part of a good soldier and accepted Castellano's leadership. In exchange, he was retained as the underboss and given a large share of the family's rackets. Violence had been averted for now, but in less than 10 years, everything would change. Both men would be dead, and John Gotti would be the new boss of the Gambino family. It's not clear if Gotti and Gambino ever really had a conversation during the handful of times they are believed to have met. But it seems clear now that he would not have approved of how Gotti ran the family.